Good morning and welcome to our class on the Passover Seder. We're going to start off by first explaining what is the whole idea of a Seder. The word Seder is translated as a organized, structured event. Seder means something that follows a sequence. It's not just a whole bunch of things thrown together. And the Torah commands us to have this Seder. Even though the word Seder doesn't appear in the Torah says that we shall celebrate this night and tell the story of the Exodus. Relate the story of the Exodus. And that's where the word Haggadah comes from. Haggadah, the root of that word means telling, recounting. But why are we so obsessed with order on Passover? You know, Jews are not known to be people who come on time or punctual. We're not so orderly. We're not so fixated on order. But the night of Passover, it seems we are. Because Passover is designed to reach children. It's an educational experience. Of course, it's a spiritual experience. It's a historical experience, but it's an educational experience. And if you look in the Torah actually says so. The whole basis of telling the story is v'higadata lebincha, you shall relate it to your son or your child, or ki yisholcha bincha, if your child will ask you, this is what you should tell him. So the whole idea of Passover revolves around educating the children. And education requires that you do things in an orderly way. And that's why in the Haggadah, the text that we use to tell the story, at the very beginning, there's a list of 15 items. Why do we have to have the list in the very beginning? Because we want to know that this event, that this evening is going to be structured around these 15 different steps. These are the 15 steps of the Seder. Because Passover is about children. It's about the 4 sons or 4 children. And the truth of the matter is, it's about every one of us, because every one of us is God's child. And every one of us possesses a childlike level of innocence. And that is what we're addressing the comments of the Seder to, that part of us that is the child, to awaken the child within us. And how many sons are there? How many children does the Seder talk about? 4. The Rabbi said there's a 5th child. The 4 are the wise one, the rebellious one, the simple one, and the one who can't ask questions, the indifferent one. That's one way of translating it. And the truth is, every one of us has all 4. There's a part of us, the fact that we're all here together to learn, is the wise child. The fact that there are some people who didn't show up, I'm only kidding, they're the rebellious ones, no. But we have a streak of rebelliousness in us. And sometimes it's a very positive thing, to rebel against negatives, to rebel against conventional wisdom that limits people. So we have this rebellion, and sometimes we use it the wrong way. We have a rebellious streak. We also have a simple part of us. Just tell me what to do. Don't bore me with all the details. I'm a simple person. And then there's the part of us that is apathetic, indifferent. And we're addressing every one of those parts of us during this night of the Seder. The truth of the matter is, the word Passover Seder is an oxymoron. And it's one of the many paradoxes that we will see through the entire night of Passover. There are so many paradoxes, and this is the first one, the very name, Passover Seder. Seder means structure, organized. Passover means passing over the structure. You're not limiting yourself. You're not committing yourself to following a structure. You're transcending it. So Passover means transcendence, and Seder means structure, because that's the ultimate goal, to bring the transcendent aspect of our soul, of our Judaism, to bring that into the structure. You see, we have a part of us that breaks out of limits, out of constraints. And that's what the Exodus is all about. What's the Hebrew word for Egypt? Mitzrayim. The word Mitzrayim doesn't mean Egypt. It means straits, confinement. We're all confined. We all fit into a mold that limits us, inhibits us, controls us. And that's what exile is all about. And then we have to break out of that. In fact, every day of the year, we're supposed to remember the Exodus. We're supposed to try to break out of limits. And the night of Passover, we have this ability to transcend these limits, but not to escape the world and defy the world and defy convention, defy nature. It's to introduce the transcendence into the structure. That's what Passover Seder means. On the Passover night, at the Seder, we have a lot of different props, a lot of different items that are at the Seder plate, and some of which we will actually eat. We have the matzah, of course. We have the bitter herbs, which could be either romaine lettuce or horseradish. And of course, the question is, why would you use romaine lettuce for bitter herbs? The romaine lettuce is not bitter. We'll talk a little bit about that later when we get to that part of the Seder. Then you have the charosis. That's the mixture of fruit and nuts and wine. And then you have a bone, a shank bone. It could be a bone of a chicken that we also have at the Seder that is symbolic of one of the offerings that the people would bring at the time of the Seder, besides the Paschal offering. You also have karpas, that's a vegetable that we're going to dip. You have an egg, and you have wine. I might have left something out. If you think I left something out, please. Leah, did I leave anything out?
Gefilte fish.
Gefilte fish is optional. So is the brisket. So let's go into the 15 steps. We have 2 weeks to Passover, so if you're planning to stay here to go through all the 15 steps, we have accommodations for everyone, because that's what it'll take to really go through every one of these 15 steps. But we'll try to do it in an hour or less. The first one is called Kaddish. Kaddish means sanctify, which is the traditional prayer that we say over a cup of wine every Friday night, every Shabbat, and every Jewish holiday. And Passover is no exception. But the difference is that in the Passover night, that cup of wine is one of the 4 cups that we're supposed to drink the night of Passover. And what does it mean? What does it signify? Well, simple meaning is we're declaring that this is a holy day. We're sanctifying the day. But it also has another message. The other message is that we are holy. And there's a need for a little bit of a background. When the Jews left Egypt, they were down in the dumps, spiritually speaking. It says that there were 50 gates of impurity. The Jewish people degenerated into the 49th penultimate level of impurity. And God had to pluck them out. They were not ready for the Exodus. They were not ready for independence, freedom. You can't just free a slave and expect them to be a part of society. They'll always have that slave mentality. They'll be limited, they'll be confined, and you can take them out, to paraphrase the famous saying, you can take them out of Egypt, but you can't take the Egypt out of them. So when we were at such a low level, and God just, on his own, so to speak, without us preparing ourselves, without us earning it, God just took us out and made us holy. in Kabbalistic literature, in Hasidic literature, there are two different modes in which we have a relationship with God. Sometimes we initiate the love affair by doing things to bring us closer to God, and God reciprocates, he responds. Sometimes it works the other way around. God says, I love you, you're my child, I will do something for you, I will schlep you out of the morass, I'll get you out of your confinement. And God says, I know you're not clean, I know you're not pure, I know you're not ready for this, but I don't want to lose you because you're my dear child. And therefore, I am making you holy. And this is a very powerful lesson to all of us, and especially in Passover. We all know our limits. We all know our flaws. We all know our deficiencies. We all know our impurities. And that gets us to think that we're horrible people, we're lowly people, and we don't deserve anything. And God says, no, Kaddish, you are holy. You are a holy people. Yes, you have flaws, but I am accepting you as you are and giving you this aura of holiness. Practically speaking, we're supposed to drink the wine, not just look at it and recite the prayer over it, but after we recite the prayer, we drink the first cup of wine. You're supposed to drink the whole cup and not do it by sipping. You're supposed to drink it in a few seconds, and if you can't do the whole cup of wine, you can do most of the cup. If you can't use wine, you could use kosher grape juice, which qualifies as wine. It's not quite like wine because it doesn't have doesn't bring you joy the way wine does, but it's acceptable if you can. Of course, a diabetic may not be allowed to drink wine, or maybe not even grape juice. So what happens if you can't grape wine or grape juice? You can use another beverage, another popular beverage. Beer you can't use because beer is comets. Beer is usually made out of grain. You can't use vodka. You could use potato vodka, but I don't recommend it. Okay, so we have to drink the whole cup of wine, and we're supposed to recline while we drink it, reclining on the left side. Why do we recline? Reclining is an expression of freedom. In the olden days, it's no longer the custom, but in the olden days, people would eat their meals, their feasts, on couches, on beds, and they would recline as a symbol of, I have all the freedom in the world, I have all the wealth, I can be as leisurely as I want when I eat my meal. So to remember the freedom, we act in a way that symbolizes freedom. And here's another one of the paradoxes of the Seder night. What are we trying to relive? The slavery or the freedom? And the answer is both. And we alternate from one to the other. And sometimes at the same time, we do things that express opposite emotions. This is the experience of the Passover night, which we'll go more into as we go on. The next thing we do is urchatz. Urchatz means washing. The word hands is added on, washing. When we eat bread, we're supposed to wash our hands. It's a ritual thing, not because they're dirty. If they're dirty, you have to first wash them with soap and dry them and then wash them with water as a ritual thing, as a way of purifying yourself. But that's usually reserved for eating bread or matzah, which is a form of bread. But there's an opinion, a minority opinion, that says that whenever you eat any food that is moist, that is wet, you have to wash your hands just like you do for bread. Now that's not the accepted practice. But on Passover night, we do it that way. Why? Because on Passover night, we do things differently. We make an effort of changing our routine. Why do we want to change our routine? For two interconnected reasons. Number one, it's to get the children to ask questions. We want the children to be awake, and we want the children to be alert and ask questions, because the questions are what gets the child more involved and brings out deeper connections to the whole experience. So that's one of the reasons we wash our hands, even though we normally don't do that, because we want the child to ask questions. Why are we doing things differently this night? And even though we have the 4 questions, it's not limited to those 4. Those are only a sampling of questions. We want the child to keep on asking a lot of questions. And even if we don't have the answer, we tell the child, we may not have the answer to this question, but keep on asking. Because asking is not just about satisfying your curiosity, it's about recognizing that you can't leave things the way they are. You have to constantly question. And I would differentiate between questioning and doubting. Doubting is not a healthy thing. Questioning is a healthy thing, but that's a subject for another time. So we wash our hands, and the second reason we wash our hands is because we want to show that Passover is about changing our routine. Yes, it's a Seder, it's structured, it's organized, but we change our routine. We don't stay in one place. And then the message is, even though we're holy, which we just established by the first item, but nevertheless, we can't fool ourselves to think that we're perfect. We have to realize we do have flaws, we do have deficiencies, we do have impurities, and we have to cleanse ourselves from them. Especially when you're doing things differently, which is a sign of rebelliousness. Rebelliousness could be an expression of your ego, or it could be an expression of you want to break away from your ego. So that's why we have to cleanse ourselves to make sure that our rebelliousness, which manifests itself by virtue of us doing things differently, is not based on ego. And that's another theme that's going to be recurrent throughout the Seder. We try to control our ego, the focus on humility. And the next thing is karpas. Karpas is a vegetable. Any vegetable we want except for bitter herbs, which were reserved for later. Some people take, Chabad custom is to take an onion. You don't eat a lot of it. And onion helps to make sure that you won't eat a lot. But you could take other vegetables. You could take a potato. You can take a cucumber. You could take what they call parsley. Any vegetable, and you dip it in salt water. Salt water, some say the reason is it's symbolic of the tears that we shed in Egypt in slavery. But the dipping is something that we do to get the child to ask the question, why are you doing something? You never do that. You never start your meal with dipping a vegetable in salt water. And even though we don't have an answer for that question, because the reason we do it is to get them to ask questions, and we may not have an answer, but still it piques their curiosity. You can't just keep on having the child ask questions for which you have no answer, because then they'll get bored. You know, the first day the kid comes to school and asks a question, and the teacher says, stop asking questions. Second day, the teacher says, don't ask foolish questions. The third day, you get older, you'll know. The fourth day, the teacher says, why are you disturbing the class? So after a full week of asking questions and the teacher just throws them off, the next week, the kid is afraid to ask any questions. And the teacher says, why aren't you asking questions? If you don't ask questions, you'll never learn. So you have to have answers every now and then. So there is an answer why we dip, because the whole idea of dipping is another expression of humility. The Hebrew word for dipping is tibul. If you rearrange the letters, it's bitul, which means nullification, self-nullification, self-effacement. Because that's the idea here, that when you dip something into something else, you're nullifying its original taste and acquiring a new taste. And that's what the focus here is on, expressing our humility by immersing ourselves in some other substance so that we lose our own ego and our own identity. It's interesting that the Hebrew word for this vegetable, karpas, is actually a composite of 2 words, samach, perech. Backbreaking work of 60. How many Jewish men were there in Egypt? 600,000. In Hebrew, there's no number above 10,000. So if you want to say 600,000, you say 60 10,000s. So the Hebrew word for this vegetable, it is said that it is the back-breaking work of 600,000. In what way was the work back-breaking? So there's an opinion in the Talmud that says it wasn't necessarily the hard work, carrying heavy loads. It was that as well. But they tried to get people to do things that they were not accustomed to. So men who usually did certain types of labor, they would have them do the type of work that women normally do, and they were not trained for that. And the women would do work that the men would normally do, that they were not trained for, and derive no pleasure in doing. That was what they did. They tried to torture people psychologically, that you should never feel comfortable in what you were doing. How do we counter that? We counter that by doing things differently this night, by showing that we're also changing our order, we're changing our habits in the interest of liberating ourselves from that type of back-breaking work. Then we get the next step. These are all preliminary steps. We didn't even start telling the story yet. Yachatz, breaking the middle matzah. We have 3 matzahs on the Seder plate, and we take the middle one and we break it into 2, hoping that we have a smaller half and a larger half. The smaller half we leave in between, sandwich in between the 2 matzahs, and the larger half we leave for the end of the meal. It's called the afikoman, the dessert. Why do we break the matzah? Matzah in general symbolizes humility. Again, the idea of humility. How does matzah symbolize humility? It's flour and water and nothing else. It doesn't even have the ability to rise. If you leave flour and water together for any amount of time, it's going to start to become what they call leaven. It'll rise. More air inside of it. The fact that matzah does not have that increase, that expansion, symbolizes humility. So matzah is the symbol of humility, and that's the symbol of our slavery, that we were humbled, and that's the state of affairs that we're trying to generate at the night of the Seder. But to reinforce the idea of humility, we break the matzah, and we have only a half a piece, but the smaller half. The Talmud says that the Hebrew word the Torah uses for matzah is lechem oni, bread of affliction. But the Hebrew word could also read a poor man's bread. What is the difference between a poor man and a rich person eating bread? The poor person never eats the whole loaf. They break off part of the loaf, the smaller part, and they eat that, and they leave the rest for the next day. So if we want to express and experience this poverty, we have the matzah in front of us, and we break the matzah, and we leave only the smaller part, the poor man's portion, in front of us. But you know what? Humility is a double-edged sword. If you're so crushed, if you feel so humbled, so broken, it can become a source of depression. And the night of Passover is the last night of the year that you would want to get depressed. It's a night that you're obligated to rejoice. It's a joyous holiday. And anyhow, depression is not a healthy thing in any event. So how do we get rid of the potential for depression after we feel crushed and humbled? We leave, well, the wine will help, of course, but we're not ready for the wine yet. We leave the second half, the larger half, for the end of the Seder. What does that tell us? That we're going to get rich. We're going to get the larger half at the end. Right now, we have to experience this humbling dimension of the Seder, but we'll have the whole matzah later on. We'll get the rest of it. At that point, we're ready for this 5th item of the Seder, Magid. Magid simply means telling, reciting the Haggadah, reciting the text of telling. Now, everyone knows the play on words. History is his story. That's not what Passover is. It's not about history. It's not his story. It's not her story either. It's our story. Everyone's story. The whole point of Passover is not to reminisce about an event of the past, not to learn about history. You can learn about history anytime you want. But Passover night, you're supposed to experience that you were in Egypt as a slave and you were liberated. And that even if you're not in Egypt and you don't know what Egypt even looks like, wherever you are, wherever we are in a form of slavery. Whether it's slavery literally to a controlling parent, a controlling teacher, a controlling boss, or whether it's because we're addicted to things. We're addicted to whatever people are addicted to. I don't have to go through the list of addictions in society. But every one of us has some addiction to something. And that's the same thing as being a slave in Egypt. So we have to experience our own addictions, our own slavery, and how we are given the power of redemption. We're given the power of liberation. So that's why all the things that we do in the Seder are in some ways, they're not just props, but they're intended to get us to internalize the message of the Exodus. So after we did all these things, we drank 1 cup of wine, gets us a little bit in the spirit. We know of our holiness. We cleansed ourselves. We changed our habits. We dipped the vegetable in the salt water, and we broke the matzah into 2, and we left the smaller half with us. Now we're ready to tell our story, not his story. And we start off with an introductory paragraph in which we say, this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Why are we saying that? Because we want to set the tone for the Seder night that we're sitting in front of and soon going to be eating the bread of affliction. It's again to reinforce that feeling of affliction. And then we say something very strange. We invite whoever is hungry, let him come and participate in the Seder. When do we say that? When we're already in the middle of the Seder, the doors are closed, and anyone who can hear the invitation is already sitting there. So the commentaries ask, it's very strange that we're inviting people in the middle of the Seder, in the privacy of our homes. Nowhere does it say you should go outside and publicly announce that everyone is invited. So the answer is, obviously, you have to invite people before Passover if you want them to come. And there are many answers to this question, but I'm just going to give you one answer, and we'll share some others in the next week's class. And that answer is, the invitation, you know who the invitation is to? To ourselves. We're inviting ourselves to the Seder. Because sometimes you could sit there, you could participate, but you're not really there. It's just a ritual. It's just something that has no relevance to your life. That means you're not really there. You're a spectator. And Judaism is not a spectator sport. You have to be involved. There was once a young boy who reached the age of bar mitzvah, and he had an audience with the Rabbi. And he didn't understand what bar mitzvah was. So the Rebbe asked him, do you play baseball? He says, yeah, sure. He said, do you ever go to watch a baseball game? He said, yeah. Does it ever happen that your team is losing and you leave before the end of the game? He says, yeah, that can happen. You don't want to see your team lose so badly, so you leave in the middle. It happens in Buffalo also, I think, with the Bills. When they're losing, people leave. He says, when you play baseball, do you ever leave in the middle of the game? And he says, no. So the Rebbe asks, what's the difference? He says, Rabbi, you don't understand how baseball works. There, I'm only a spectator. If I don't like what I'm seeing, I leave. But when I play baseball, that's me. I'm playing. It's not something. So that's the difference between before bar mitzvah and after bar mitzvah. Before bar mitzvah, you're a spectator. You're watching how other people live Jewish lives. After your bar mitzvah, and the same would apply to bat mitzvah, of course, it's your game. You can't leave in middle. You can't take it less seriously than anyone else. You are living that. That's part of you now. And that's what the whole Seder has to generate, that we are experiencing the affliction as well as the exodus, the liberation. And we have to invite ourselves to be part of that. And then we have the 4 questions. It begins with the words Manastana. Why is this night different from all of the other nights? Beautiful. Thank you. That was the musical version of Manastana. You know, the chief rabbi of England was going to be knighted by the Queen. And he was told that when she knights you, I don't know how it works, you're supposed to say some words in Latin. So he tried to memorize them. But he got very nervous, and he's standing there, and he forgot all his Latin words. He didn't speak Latin. So he decided he's going to say something in Hebrew. No one will know the difference. So he said, Manastana halayla hazeh mikol halelot. And the Queen looks at him and turns to the people next to her and says, why is this night different from all other nights?
Is that a true story?
I don't think so.
I love that.
It's a wonderful joke.
Yeah.
So why is this night different from all other nights? And we asked 4 questions. One question we asked, there are different orders in which they're said. One question we ate, why we eat matzah. The whole rest of the year we eat comets, unleavened bread, and matzah. And now we eat only matzah. Why do we eat bitter herbs? All year round we don't eat bitter herbs necessarily. Why do we dip? We don't normally dip 2 times in every meal. And the 4th one, why do we recline? So there are many different interpretations of these 4 questions, which we'll go into maybe next week. But just one interpretation given by the Abarbanel. Abarbanel was a finance minister of Spain during the reign of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. And when the Jews were expelled from Spain, he was allowed to stay, but he refused to stay, and he also left with all the Jews. So he wrote a commentary on the Haggadah. He wrote dozens of other books, but this was one classic. And he explains that the 4 questions are really one question. Why are we having these opposites? We eat matzah. Matzah symbolizes the Exodus. When we left Egypt in a haste, we had to bake matzah. Then we eat bitter herbs, which is the opposite. It's expressive of our suffering, our pain. We dip, which is in the salt water, which is the tears that we shed, and we recline to show that we're free. So there are opposites here. And that's the whole point. The whole idea of the Seder is paradox. We do opposites. We experience the pain, the bitterness, the suffering, and we experience the freedom and the joy. Then we have the 4 sons, the 4 children, which I mentioned at the beginning, the wise one, the wicked or rebellious one, the simple one, or the one who can't even ask questions. We're assuming that means that the person is either so dull and so lacking intelligence that they can't even ask questions, but it could also mean someone who is apathetic, who doesn't care. They once asked someone, what's worse, indifference or ignorance? And the person answered, I don't know and I don't care. They usually go together. One of the requirements, the Talmud says, is that when we tell the story, we have to begin with the negative. We have to begin with the not such pleasant aspects of our lives. We don't hide anything in Judaism. The Torah doesn't hide anything about even the most heroic people, even the holiest people. The Torah tells you about their flaws, and not only tells you about them, but magnifies the flaws, exaggerates the flaws of the greatest people. No other religious text, no other historical text written by the people who are trying to promote themselves will tell you about all their foibles, about all their faults. But anyhow, we're supposed to start off talking about the negatives. So there are two opinions, as you can imagine, that there'll be at least two opinions about everything. One opinion says you should start talking about the slavery. Some people don't like to think about their past when they were... I had many opportunities to visit people in prisons and became very friendly with a lot of the prisoners, but yet the minute they left prison, they don't want to have anything to do with you. Why? Because they don't want to have any memories of their past. They want their lives to start as free people. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but the general attitude was, once I get out of this horrible place called prison, I don't want to remember a single thing about it. So the Haggadah says, no, we're going to tell the story. We were in Egypt. We were slaves. We were lowly people. We didn't start off in grandiose ways. We didn't start off as being noble people and powerful people. We started off as lowly slaves. The other opinion says, no, we should talk about the spiritual degradation. So we do both. Sometimes you can satisfy both opinions. In the middle of the Haggadah, we start off with the words, in the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. Now, that's the lowest thing you could say about someone. I don't want to tell you that my great-grandfather was an idol worshiper. It's not pleasant to talk about your yichus that way. You know. So we tell this truth, that our ancestors were idol worshippers. And then when we talk about how we got out of those two situations, the physical degradation and the spiritual degradation, the liberation, the Exodus has so much more depth and so much more meaning, so much more power when you go from the negative to the positive. In the Haggadah, there's also a song that everyone sings, Dayenu. Dayenu is a list of 15 items. If God would have just taken us out of Egypt and he wouldn't have done this, Dayenu, that would have been enough for us to thank God. If God would have done this miracle and not the next one, Dayenu. We go through 15 steps. And this is traditionally sung to a tune. And Max, you have Dayenu?
Yeah.
You can sing along if you want.
Could you sing too? Yeah.
Do they parallel?
Oh, sorry.
Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. Thank you. I guess that the question was that these 15 parallel the 15 items of the Seder. It's very tempting to say that, but I can't guarantee that they're connected. But it's a very good point. Someone could write a PhD thesis on that. Then we also sing or recite halal. Halal is a collection of psalms that is said on Jewish holidays, on joyous holidays. We don't say it on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, but only on joyous holidays in order to praise God for the miracles. And we say half of it at this point, this part of the Seder, because telling the story is not enough. It's not enough to tell a story of how someone helped you without saying how appreciative you are for that help. So telling the story is also an expression of appreciation. You're telling the story because you appreciate it, but you have to go out and say, I think what you did for us was wonderful, and I want to praise you for that. So we praise God for the miracles. And when we finish this part of the Haggadah, we drink our second cup of wine. So we got through half of the Seder. We drink 2 cups of wine, again, reclining on your left, and drinking preferably the whole cup in a few gulps, if not the whole, at least most of it. Then we wash our hands again. Why do we wash our hands again? Because now we're going to do it for real. It's the matzah that we're going to be eating. But what does it mean spiritually? There are two kinds of cleansing. When a person is trying to develop and grow spiritually, the first type of cleansing is where you were impure, where you associated yourself with a negative force. Let's say a child who grows up in the ghetto and develops a very immoral and very violent way of living. They have to go through a change. They have to cleanse themselves. But what happens now? They're law-abiding, and now they're going their lives are rehabilitated. You think no more cleansing is necessary. But Judaism says, no, there's no such thing. A Jew who's at a certain point in a positive scale has to always reach a higher level. And you have to go through a purification process between the lower level and the higher level. Because if you're stuck in a certain level, even though it's not negative, you're in a rut. You're back again in Egypt. You're back again in Mitzrayim. Because Judaism was designed for constant growth. And people, we're all human, and as human beings, we don't like the unknown. And if we get used to living in a certain way, in a certain standard, we feel comfortable there. We carve out a comfortable niche, and we don't want to leave that. Someone once used the analogy of you open up a radish, it's a Yiddish expression, and there's a little worm there. The worm feels very content living in the radish. Doesn't want anything more than that. But we're not worms. We are human, and as humans, we have to constantly grow in our spirituality. So at this point of the Seder, we're already clean, we've cleansed ourselves already, we drank 2 cups of wine, so our spirits are lifted. We have to recognize that there's a higher level that we have to reach. And that's why we wash our hands again, the spiritual reason. And then we take the matzah. Okay, here's where you need a little bit of instruction to know how to do the matzah. The person who has the Seder plate, there are many customs about the Seder plate. The most prevalent one is that one person, the household leader, has the Seder plate, and everyone else listens to everyone could say the Haggadah, but one person has the Seder plate, and everyone gets a piece of matzah. How much matzah do you have to eat? So the requirement is that you eat, and if you're talking about a machine-baked matzah, those square matzahs, about a half of the matzah you have to eat, and you have to eat it within about 7 minutes. So again, no nibbling. You have to take it seriously. You have to really eat it. If you're eating a shmura matzah, they're larger, the round ones. They can be made any size, but usually they're larger. About a third of the matzah would be adequate. So which matzah do you eat when you're dealing with a Seder plate? You remember you have 3 matzahs. One is the whole one, the middle one is broken one, then another whole one. You take all 3, you lift all 3, and you make the blessing hamozi, which you always say whenever you eat bread. So there's no exception. Matzah is the same thing. What is hamozi? You're thanking God for producing the matzah. And there's a spiritual point to it as well. If you think that bread or matzah comes from a bakery, comes from a supermarket shelf, comes from Mother Nature, you'll never get out of Egypt. Because you are living a fantasy. Matzah and all food comes from God, who endowed nature, Mother Nature, with the power to produce nutrients and to produce food. If you want to get out of Egypt, the first thing you have to recognize where everything comes from. That things don't come from, just like the child who thinks that the food, the candy comes from the candy store, doesn't recognize that it has to be manufactured. If we just go back a few steps, but don't go back the entire way to its ultimate source, then we are, in a sense, living a life of fantasy, and we're back again in our Egypt and our own Mitzrayim. That's the first thing. So we make the bracha hamozi, holding all 3 matzahs. Then we drop the bottom matzah. We let go of it. You don't have to drop it. You let go of it, and you make another blessing, which is the special blessing for the mitzvah, for the commandment to eat matzah. And it starts off with a regular beginning. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to eat matzah. And we take that matzah, we take a piece of it. Ideally, the one who has the Seder plate takes a piece of the top matzah and a piece of the middle matzah and reclines on his left and eats the matzah within prescribed amount of time, like about 7 minutes. And that fulfills the mitzvah of eating matzah. But the mitzvah of eating matzah is more than just a commemorative thing, reminding ourselves of the matzah that our ancestors ate. What the eating of matzah is ingesting spirituality. Generally, whenever we do a mitzvah, whenever we do a positive act, we're generating spirituality, but it's never internalized, except when you eat it. This is the only time where the actual eating becomes a spiritual activity. Every time you eat, you can elevate the food by eating for the right reasons, to have strength, to be able to do good. But here, the mitzvah of eating itself becomes the end. And that's why it has so much power. What is exactly the difference between matzah and comets? So I explained before that matzah is the flour and water not allowed to rise. And comets is where you allow it to rise. But there's also an interesting difference that the word chametz and matzah share the same letters, with one little exception. The word chametz has the letter ches. The letter ches is like a line on top and 2 lines vertically coming down. What that symbolizes is that you can only go down. Matzah has the letter hey, which is almost the same as the ches. It has a horizontal line, a vertical line on the right, and a vertical line on the left, but it doesn't touch the roof. There's an escape valve. That means that even if you're being pulled down, you have the ability to escape. That's the power of matzah. The power of matzah enables us to get out of our rut, to get out of our downward flow. I have to know how to work it.
Let me see if I can get a marker for you.
A person who is a comets person, a person who is full of himself or herself, is going downhill and cannot extricate himself or herself from their confinement, from their slavery. That's why matzah is so important. Then we eat the morar, the bitter herbs. The bitter herbs, as I said before, could either be romaine lettuce or horseradish, and some people combine the two. Why romaine lettuce, which is not really bitter? So the Talmud explains that the way Jews were enslaved did not happen overnight. Pharaoh didn't just wake up one day and he said, from now on, the Hebrews...
Marker for the board.
No, you need to... From now on, the Hebrews... From now on, they're going to be slaves. They would have not allowed that. They were an honored minority because they saved Egypt. Joseph saved Egypt. What he did was to trick them. He started off very sweetly. He told people, we're going to rebuild Egypt. Who is patriotic here? Who wants to join me? I'm going to be working myself, and everyone's going to get paid. And the Egyptians and the Jews both participated. And then little by little, he allowed the Egyptians to stop working. So now the Jews, but still getting paid, and little by little he decreased their pay until there was no pay at all. And they discovered they were now regimented into a slave labor force. So that's the reason why we eat romaine lettuce, because the root of romaine lettuce, if you leave it in the ground, it becomes extremely bitter, inedible. It starts sweet and becomes bitter. And there's a very powerful lesson in that. We never fall into the morass. We never fall into the abyss with just one step, precipitously. It's always a process. So when a person feels they're going down, they shouldn't say, what's the big deal? I'm only going down a little. Because going down a little, it can start off being sweet, it can become very bitter in the end. So we eat the bitter herbs, and we dip it into charosis, the sweet mixture of fruit and nuts and wine. And part of the reason we dip it into the charosis reminds us of the mortar. It resembles the mortar that we use to build bricks. But it also tells us that you have to temper the bitterness. You can't wallow in bitterness. You can't wallow in your misery and your anguish. But even if the anguish is justified, why is the anguish justified? Because even though we're now pretty free, and we already went through a part of the Seder that symbolizes freedom, we're not really free as long as there are some who are still slaves, as long as they're still suffering. The Jewish people are an organic people, and if one Jew is still in exile, then we are all in exile. The only way we can be free is if everyone is free. And therefore, we have to eat the bitter herbs as a way of empathizing with all those who are still not free. But we can't wallow in that bitterness. We can't wallow in our feeling of sadness that there's still a lot of misery in the world. You know, there are people who become so incapable of functioning because they're just paralyzed, emotionally paralyzed, because they're just focusing on all the sadness and all the misery and all the negatives. You can't do that, first of all, because you won't be able to help anyone if you're depressed. And secondly, that's not what God wants of us. He wants us to live a joyous life, even as we empathize and we have times when we feel the suffering and pain of others. So we temper it with a little charosis, but we don't eat the charosis. You could not at the Seder. You could eat it later, because you don't want to take away the bitterness. You want the bitterness to be there. But then we go to the korech, to the sandwich. There's a myth that the sandwich was invented by some British guy in the 18th century, but it's not true. Hillel already had a sandwich. He would eat the matzah with the lamb of the Paschal offering and the bitter herbs together. And we do the same thing, except we don't have the Paschal offering, but we have everything else. And what he did is he brought the opposites together. He brought the bitter herbs, together with the Paschal lamb, which symbolizes the freedom, and the matzah. Sometimes we have the ability to synthesize opposites, which is, again, the theme that the Seder has recurrent, the idea of the paradox, bringing opposites together. Then we're ready for the meal. You know, they tell the story of this non-Jew who heard a lot about the Seder, and he said, I want to come to a Seder, and he comes there, and he starves all day because he knows it's going to be a gourmet meal. And then what do they serve in the beginning? They take a piece of onion and dip it into salt water. You know, not very appetizing. And then finally, they're ready for the meal, and they give him some matzah. And he almost breaks his teeth on the matzah. Okay, then after the bitter herbs, and by the time he finishes with all the things, the requirements, he's so sick and tired of this Seder, he runs out. If he only waited a little bit longer, he would have had the brisket. So we eat the meal, the holiday meal, and we start with an egg dipped in salt water. Why that egg? So there are several reasons, but the main reason is that in the days of the temple, when we had the sacrifices, you were obligated to eat the Paschal lamb as dessert. Before that, you had to eat the festival offering. The Paschal lamb was not to be eaten as the main course. It was the last course of the meal. Why? There are several reasons given. One reason given is people are pretty hungry at this point, and if you're going to have the first piece of real food would be the lamb chop, people are going to eat it ravenously. That's not the way a rich person, a free person eats. You don't want, you see people starving, homeless people starving, they get a sandwich, they just gobble it down. That doesn't express freedom. Freedom is expressed when you eat patiently, you're reclining and you feel like you're on a cloud. So the Paschal lamb would be the last thing you would eat. And before that, you would eat meat from another sacrifice, another offering. And the second reason is you want that the taste of the Paschal lamb should stay in your mouth. It shouldn't be watered down by anything else. So yes, we're going to drink another 2 cups of wine, but we're not going to eat anything else after the Paschal lamb. We don't have the Paschal lamb now, so we eat that large piece of matzah that we hid somewhere, and that piece of matzah is the last thing we will eat at the Seder night. So whatever else you want to eat it before that piece of matzah. And then we eat tzafon, hidden. Hidden means the afikomen which we hid. Why do we hide it? So some people say, so the kids should look for it and blackmail the parents. If you don't get me that new computer game, I'm not going to give you back the afikomen. That's not necessarily the ideal way of educating children, to blackmail their parents, but that's not the real reason we hide it. Because when you hide, the word tzafon means hiding. There are different dimensions of spirituality. There are the revealed levels and there are the hidden levels. There are also different dimensions of evil. There is the obvious, overt evil, and there's the hidden, insidious evil. At this point of the Seder, we're able to reveal the hidden energies of our soul that enable us to get rid of and wage war against the hidden energies of impurity, of evil. So until this point, we're dealing with the more overt levels. At this point, we're able to do and deal with the more hidden ones. And then we are ready for the grace after meals, thanking God for the food, followed by the 3rd cup of wine, and at which point we fill up another cup, and we don't drink this cup. This is called the cup of Elijah. Elijah the prophet is said to come to every Seder. He doesn't come physically, because if he would be arrested for drunk driving, drunk walking. Instead, he comes spiritually, so you don't have to look. I know kids look at the cup to see if a little bit of it is missing, but there's no evidence that Elijah actually drinks the cup of wine, but he's present there spiritually. And we open the door for Elijah to come in, and we say a special prayer about how God should express his anger at all the forces of evil that have persecuted us, because that's what the exodus from Egypt was, a persecution of the Jewish people by Pharaoh and his countrymen. So we welcome Elijah over a special cup of wine. If you want to play the tune about Elijah, Max. This is our final musical interlude. Eliyahu Tishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Giladi. Beautiful. Then we're ready for halal, the completion of the Psalms that we started saying before the meal, praising God. Now we're thinking about the future. We turn our focus not to the past, but to the future, that we believe that there will be another exodus, but not from Egypt, but from all of exile, coming with the coming of Mashiach, who will be announced by Elijah. So we sing this second part of Hallel, and some people add many other hymns, followed by the 4th cup of wine. And then the last item is nirtza, that God has accepted our service. Sometimes we do things and God responds and says, I accept everything you did. When we finish the Seder, we know that God has welcomed what we did and accepted everything that we said. And then we conclude with the words, next year in Jerusalem, which doesn't mean next year. It means by the time next year comes around and we'll be celebrating the Seder, we will already be in Jerusalem, but not Jerusalem the way it is today, but a Jerusalem in peace, with a 3rd temple built on the Temple Mount, with the participation of all of the Jewish people. So some people have a phrase at the end of the Seder, Chasal Seder Pesach. The order of Passover is over. We concluded it. Chabad custom is not to say those words because the Seder never ends. The idea of freedom, the idea of breaking out of constraints is a continuous process that doesn't end with the Seder. We just take a little break from the Seder, but we don't really end the Seder. Some people have other hymns they say at the end of the Seder. I guess it's to keep children awake. They're famous melodies. Echad Miyodea, who knows one? And we go through the numbers 1 through 13. And then there's Chad Gadya, the story of the little goat that was eaten by the cat and bitten by the dog. And that's said to be actually describing all the different stages of the Jewish people going through different suffering throughout their long history. If anyone has any questions, please feel free.
I do.
Yes.
And it sort of brings, it's a liturgical question, not specifically Haggadah, but related, because you talked about purity. What came to mind is Elohai Neshama. So, like, what is the idea of purity? If our liturgy says our soul
The soul is pure, yes.
and it's everything else.
But
that
the
is
soul becomes soiled because of the body. Its interaction with the body and the physical world gives the soul a bad reputation. So we have to cleanse ourselves. Any other questions? We have a form over here. Since we're supposed to sell comets, because as I explained last week, we're not allowed to own comets. So we sell it through the rabbi. The rabbi is the agent to sell the comets to a non-Jew for the duration of Passover. So all you have to do is fill this out, and the address where the chametz is, and you don't have to do anything to the chametz. Just keep it in a cupboard and just make sure the cupboard is sealed. A piece of tape across that you don't, by mistake, go and eat any of it. But this gets rid of your ownership of chametz. You don't have to actually remove it from your home if you don't.
You pay someone who isn't Jewish, but you don't have to bring.
Well, I do the sale. It's a whole sale that I take everyone's form and I give it to the non-Jew, and he now owns all the chametz. He's the legal owner, and if he wants, he can come into your house anytime he wants, and he can take any amount of chametz. At the end of Passover, he'll have to pay for it, and he'll get a good discount for it.
So he takes my first one.
But he owns.
Okay, so I don't have to bring a bag of hummus.
No, you don't have to bring it. No.
I meant I don't have to
Because
out of my house.
there are 3 prohibitions of chametz. One prohibition is we're not allowed to eat it. Then we're not allowed to derive benefit from it during Passover. And then we're not allowed to own it. And by selling it, you avoid being the owner of it.
Although it's good, they go through it, and if you have anything that you don't use, to donate it to the food pantry so someone else can
What?
benefit from it.
Hummus also includes the plates, the silverware, and the
Right.
pots you use.
All your non-Passover cutlery,
It's a lot of stuff.
pots and pans, dishes, you put away, and that's included in the sale.
Yes.
So do you have to have your own set of pans, pots and pans?
For Passover?
For Passover?
Yes. Everything different for Passover.
Plates come in handy.
There is a way of koshering cutlery and pots for Passover, but that's a whole long process. It's better if you want to give a donation, you're wherever you want. You can give it to me or put it in there.
No, and what about
Somebody
Okay, Yeshua.